So, Shin Megami Tensei V Vengeance is being released either today or tomorrow, depending on when I get this video out, and so to celebrate, let's say, I'm going to go over 6 things that I want from this game in this short video to hold out the algorithm until my next one is ready. I also plan to do a video on 5 Vengeance either this month or next after I've played the game and sorted out my thoughts and feelings of, so subscribe if you are interested in my video on the topic. And with that said, here are 6 improvements that 5 Vengeance needs to be good. Alright, a quick edit. My computer crashed while I was working on this video, and so I lost a lot of my progress. The rest of this video is just going to be a still image over my voice, as I want to get this video out before 5 Vengeance is released, and fear that I won't have time to properly edit the whole thing if I commit to it as is. So if you are wondering why the lack of movement on screen, that is why. Number 1. Skip the tutorial. In hindsight, the fact that SMT5 forces the player into a tutorial was a red flag. In both Nocturne and 4, the tutorial was organically woven into the area, tied to smaller scale goals, quests in SMT4, and trying to get a grasp of the situation in Nocturne, creating an immediate intrigue while still teaching the player how to play the game. Remember that, unlike say, Raido Kuzunoha, which still did this better, SMT5 is a turn-based JRPG, and turn-based combat isn't really that difficult to learn how to do, even if it is your first time playing such a game. So a hand-holding tutorial that treats the player like they are stupid is frustrating, insulting, and a waste of time. At least the option to skip it would be appreciated if they don't remove it, so as to retain the base SMT5 experience in the canon of creation. I don't think that is too much to ask, because that has been the standard in the series for a very long time, but ideally, the start of the game shouldn't have been botched in the first place. And I hope that this, at least, isn't repeated in the canon of Vengeance. 2. Another thing that I should be able to skip. Demon Haunts. To me, Demon Haunts and their associated social interactions just reek of another attempt to add a persona-like into SMT when it is unnecessary and contrasts with the tone. See the text messages of For Apocalypse and the Bartok of Soul Hackers 2 for other vapid examples. The latter relegating moments that flesh out the characters to bits of missable text, and the latter being the dullest part of the game. In fairness, Soul Hackers 2 had a thematic reason for its social system, and thus locking the good ending behind their outcome made sense, but that didn't change that the Bartok was the dullest feature that Atlus has ever conceived of, and I don't want to have to slog through that again. Especially since SMT doesn't have the excuse of being thematically associated with individuals so much as individual perspectives. If they are going to be included, at least give me the option to opt out, so that I don't have to deal with the boredom of watching a vapid imitation of social links. Social links work because the core conceit of Persona is in psychology. This is a bit controversial, I know, but I really liked how development in Persona 4 was handled via the use of social links with the protagonist, helping their friends work through their lingering emotional hang-ups. I felt almost like a therapist, or at least like a real friend offering emotional support to another in their time of need, like an actual friend would, and said friend coming out better for it. It was immersive and added to the characters. And while not done perfectly in that the characters could feel stagnant and character development couldn't always feel as palpable when done in the social links carrying over to the main plot, which are easy fixes with just some script changes to modify dialogue and character interactions if done in the future, the social link stories still felt like they were fleshing out the characters in a way impossible without them. There are multiple reasons why social simulation hasn't translated well into non-Persona SMT games, but the primary reason goes back to what I said in my previous video. That by tying the whole of the alignments to singular, insular perspectives, the game creates biases that limit what each alignment can be by virtue of the game only focusing on a limited pool of perspectives which can and do actively clash with what the alignment system is supposed to represent and why it worked in previous games. This is part of the reason why the intended chaos and neutral endings felt like the other, and why the endings as a whole feel more like arbitrarily assigned spiritual beliefs with the aesthetic of law, chaos, and neutral, rather than the alignment's corresponding ethics and how they place within a spectrum. I have more problems with how alignment was handled, and in fairness, not all of it is the problem of Persona's influence, which some don't appear to have fully grasped from my previous video, despite me saying as much within, but my point at present is that social interactions in SMT games serve as a detriment to the themes because it causes the broad ideas to become focused and insular. This works great for a game with a more focused theme like the Persona series, and while I may hate the implementation, the same is true for Soul Hackers 2. And like that game, it honestly wouldn't surprise me if the developers did lock the quote-unquote good or true ending behind accessing a certain amount or specific social interactions in the Demon Haunts, but I am holding out hope that that isn't the case. One comment that I got on my SMT5 is Persona Without the Heart video was from someone who was actually looking forward to the Demon Haunts because of the new non-negotiating interactions with demons, which is a feature not often seen within SMT, which is fair and I would not object to, since demon interactions are funny, charming, and occasionally even insightful, but I am talking about the human characters given that they are where this problem would manifest as. Of course, there is the possibility that the social interactions in the Demon Haunts will simply be an additional bonus, rather than a detrimental, poorly implemented concept that detracts from the overall game by clashing with the tone or being excessively shallow. But history paints a different picture with this trend, although, as better characterization in the main story is actually something that the trailers are emphasizing, and do showcase some potential in that regard, I can actually muster hope that that is the case. That the bulk of character growth and their mindset for choosing their alignments is handled in the main story, and with the focus on them as people rather than as a collective friend group where corresponding relationships with the protagonist and other characters would be more likely to unify them beneath a singular side due to mutual loyalty, and that the Demon Haunts are a nice bonus to showcase some additional sides to them, or even subtly, how they are developing within the story. 3. Fix the balancing, or at the very least the buffs and debuffs. I've mentioned this before, but the gameplay of SMT5 is severely disappointing. I've seen a lot of praise for it, however, and for the life of me, I cannot understand why. The introduced platforming is very basic and has a lot of instances where the inability to platform up or into an area feels like an oversight, and the combat is the worst that it has been in the series since the 90s. Buffs and debuffs are now useless. I abandoned them after the first area when I saw that they had little to no effect, and never really bothered to get them undone after that because it just wasn't worth wasting a turn when I could just focus on doing raw damage and pressing turns to increase said numbers. Fierce Roar was the only exception to this, but it wasn't the buff that I was using, but rather the fact that the move caused enemies to target the one using it, which is a good redirect strategy, especially on a demon that I know I can exploit the move with. It's worth noting that buffs and debuffs work in SMT5 more like in Persona, where they wear off after a set amount of time and need to be replenished in order to keep up a comparatively minimal effect, which makes the effort to stack largely pointless. In earlier SMT games, buffs and debuffs could be game-changing and had a lot of fluidity in the strategy options that they offered. For example, I could buff or debuff fully not for the benefits of, but to instead force a boss to use the Kunda or the Kaja to buy time to heal or resurrect a party member when low on HP. A strategy that on my first fight with Beelzebub in Nocturne turned the fight from a crushing near defeat to victory. In SMT5, buffs and debuffs have no value because their benefits are mediocre, and the primary factor to cause damage is the difference in level, meaning that grinding is the only determining factor between life and death, as opposed to something controllable and customizable in the game, such as stats, affinities, movesets, and equipped essences, although resistances and affinities are palpable in most cases. Quite frankly, a lot of this game would need to be reworked to be balanced, but at least changing the buffs and debuffs back to being, like SMT, would do wonders in actually fixing the difficulty compared to how bloated and artificial and yet brain dead that it was in SMT5. At the very least, it would offer an alternative in increasing or decreasing damage numbers than wasting hours grinding for no other reason than to increase in level. There is more to be said on fixing the difficulty, a lot more, but I fear the worst, and so request the bare minimum. It feels weird that this has to be said, but number 4 is to have alignment matter. Rather than just choosing the endings, as was the case in 4 Apocalypse and 5, have choices, and thus the alignment feel like it carries weight long term. It feels obvious, and I don't want to dwell too long on this, but it is still very annoying to feel like my choices have been robbed of impact on the game, especially when a big part of the alignment concept is to have one's ethics influence the outcome of the story. Hard decisions that question the player's morals and using the options selected to shift the player onto the logical outcome of said path is one of the things that makes SMT interesting and thought-provoking. Stop taking that away from the series, especially because it only exposes the shallowness of this game's story and the understanding of the subject matter it tries to convey. Alternatively is the strange journey option of having a late game decision to shift alignment right before the alignment lock if one is neutral or fairly close to, but still respecting the player's previous decisions made if they are far law or chaos, since it is somewhat obvious what route they are going for or what they feel they have communicated with their choices in the game. I don't really think I need to explain anything beyond this, so let's move on. Alright, so combat was really bland, but what about the open world? Never before did we have an open world SMT game, and people online literally compared it to Breath of the Wild, one of the most fully realized and immersive open worlds I've ever played that perfectly captured the appeal of a raw, untainted adventure out in the wilderness. I have to wonder what the people comparing SMT5 to Breath of the Wild are smoking, because much like the rest of the game, SMT5's open world is bland and basic. Not a terrible first attempt, but nowhere near the highs that it was compared to when first released, and more importantly felt a lot emptier than the lively dungeons with random encounters in previous games. In the past, whenever an abandoned building could be explored, it was repurposed by the new demon inhabitants, turning an office building into a prison, a mall into a coliseum, and the top of Tokyo Tower into an art gallery, while the subways had been turned into the slums where humans try and survive the elements and occupation of demons. Despite the worlds being small and largely being relegated to an explorable map with many dungeon entrances, the worlds of SMT4 and Nocturne felt more alive and lived in, and the demons more like an occupying presence having moved into the abandoned urban ruins. By contrast to this liveliness, in SMT5, the abandoned buildings tend to be barren. NPC dialogue is scattered and seldom about the local demons going about their everyday lives, and the abandoned buildings that once added an ironic flair of personality to the post-apocalypse are gone, with most demons choosing to live and seek shelter from the elements in caves instead. Two locations that feel perfect to be designed after this concept are the Demon King's Castle and the Diet Building, the latter being especially confounding since it is devoid of anything of note after Nuwa and Yakumo retreat, despite housing the Amala drum to enter and exit the Neverworld from. It should be an occupied stronghold again like it had been before the protagonist arrived, as the angels were killed by Nuwa, but is instead left largely abandoned and barren, despite canonically being the way the Nahobino comes and goes, and having the potential to allow demons to come into Tokyo. The closest is a researcher who just spends time in the same room as the Amala drum, without ever bothering to see if any of the demons outside have decided to waltz into an underground building where a tasty, defenseless human soul is. However, the larger offender is the Demon King's Castle, which feels perfect to be a repurposed building. It's literally a castle, and buildings the size of, or even greater than, are of no shortage in Tokyo. A prison could have been thematically relevant given the understanding of hell as a prison in Christian mythology, and Da'at serving a similar role thematically in the story as the world where the banished gods reside, akin to the Abyss in SMT2. If not a school, police station, or JSDF military base, something. Instead, the castle is a generic JRPG dungeon with a strong black and red aesthetic that feels too on the nose as hellful rather than Shin Megami Tensei. Bringing the locale of destroyed Tokyo to life like this is one of the biggest things that I'd like to see in 5 Vengeance. They don't have to be full-on dungeons, but just a few NPCs in ruins going about their random slice-of-life demon days, moving into and repurposing them, be it a business, home, or hangout. What's striking is that the nonsensical caves scattered about would have been a perfect way to use this. Have someone's old home or a school be the place where the Preta worship Apsaris, and showcase the camping demons in the buildings rather than the caves. It's not hard, not too much to ask, adds a lot to the game's world building and a post-apocalyptic aesthetic, and has been a series staple since the beginning, to the point that it's honestly shocking that it wasn't there in the first place. And the final thing that I want from SMT 5 Vengeance is better platforming, and to integrate this mechanic better into the game's world design and dungeon puzzles. Platforming is a genre that I really like, and I also really like that SMT implemented this mechanic within their open world, but as I mentioned earlier, the platforming in this game is basic at best. And with a lot of instances where not being able to jump into, onto, or at something feels like an oversight, and as a result, the jumping proper doesn't really feel like it adds a lot to the gameplay, outside of the isolated instances where one can scale up debris like shipping containers like stairs, or getting to a roof so as to access a previously sealed off building. These instances are few and far between, and really just go to show how basic the open world really is on a design level with regards to this mechanic as much as it is barren in the liveliness department. Just imagine using the Nahobino's high jump to be able to scale up to new locations otherwise inaccessible from ground level to find hidden secrets, treasures, and obscure boss battles, as well as using this idea more cleverly to navigate puzzles, dungeons, and locations in the open world. In the Demon King's castle, there were instances where one needed to jump from ledge to ledge in order to get to a needed location, and while a small touch only present in a few areas, still showcases the possibility of using jump to create an interesting method of traversing an area, or even needing to use it so as to solve dungeon puzzles. Perhaps reworking it into existing dungeons is too much to ask, but I do hope that this does happen in the new dungeon, and perhaps even in the new area overall. Just really capitalize on this potential is what I'm saying.